The gun went off before Genevieve Parrish even understood what her hands were doing. The smoke curled from the barrel of the old Colt revolver in a lazy spiral, rising toward the rafters of the Dustfall saloon. And for one suspended moment, every man in that room forgot how to breathe. The mirror behind the bar fractured in a spiderweb pattern, sending shards of silvered glass cascading down over the whiskey bottles like a sudden winter. She had not aimed at the mirror on purpose. She had not aimed at anything on purpose. Her hands had simply moved because Hector Dunley's hand had moved first, reaching for the deed she had laid on the bar between them. And something primal and desperate had fired through her body before her mind could catch up with it. "That deed belongs to the Parrish family," she said, and she was proud that her voice did not shake, even though every bone in her body felt like river water. "And you will not touch it." Hector Dunley was 43 years old, red-faced in the way that heavy drinkers get red-faced, and he had more money than God and less mercy than the devil. He was currently staring at the hole in the saloon mirror with an expression that cycled rapidly through shock, fury, and then something far more dangerous than either of those, which was calculation. "You just discharged a firearm in my town, girl," he said softly. "It is not your town yet," she said. That was when she felt it. Not heard it, not saw it. Felt it. A weight of attention from the far corner of the room, steady and deliberate as a compass needle swinging north. She had not noticed the man sitting there when she walked in. He was the kind of man you did not notice until suddenly he was the only thing in the room you could see. He sat with his back to the wall, a cup of coffee going cold on the table in front of him, and he was looking at her. Not at the gun, not at the broken mirror. Not at Hector Dunley, who was the most powerful man in Calhoun County, Texas, in the year of our Lord 1874. He was looking at her, and the look said something she could not quite translate. It was too complex. It contained too much. It said, "I see you." It said, "You are not alone." It said, "Be careful now." It said several other things she would spend the next 3 months trying to decipher. His name, she would learn within the hour, was Vaughn Mercer, and he owned the Broken Spur cattle operation north of town. He had not said a single word during the entire confrontation. He would not say many words in the months that followed. But that first look across the smoky interior of the Dustfall saloon would stay with Genevieve Parrish longer than any speech, any declaration, any promise she had ever received from any man in her 26 years of living. Which was saying something, because men had been making promises to Genevieve all her life. None of them had ever kept them. She had come to Calhoun County from the eastern edge of Bexar County 6 weeks earlier, riding a horse she had borrowed without asking from her late aunt's estate, carrying a deed to 400 acres of prime grazing land that her father, Edmund Parrish, had purchased in 1868. Edmund Parrish had died of a rattlesnake bite in the spring of '73, leaving Genevieve as the sole heir to land she had never seen, in a town she had never visited, in a county where her family name meant nothing to anyone. What she had not known when she left was that Hector Dunley had decided that those 400 acres were his. He had not purchased them, or negotiated for them, or attempted any legal means of acquisition. He had simply decided. In Calhoun County in 1874, Hector Dunley's decisions had a way of becoming facts. She had ridden into town on a Wednesday morning in late September, and by Wednesday afternoon, she had learned 3 essential truths about Calhoun County. The first was that the grass was the most extraordinary color she had ever seen, a deep autumn gold that rippled in the wind like something alive. The second was that there was no law in Calhoun County that was not in some way connected to Hector Dunley's pocket. The third was that a woman alone with a land deed was considered, by most of the men in this territory, to be a problem waiting to be solved. She had taken a room at Mrs. Della Croft's boarding house on Sycamore Street, which was the only street in Dustfall that had a name written on a sign rather than simply being identified by what it was next to. Mrs. Croft was a widow of 55 with iron-gray hair and opinions sharp enough to cut leather, and she had looked Genevieve up and down when she arrived and said, "You are either very brave or very foolish coming here alone." "Both, most likely," Genevieve had said, and Mrs. Croft had liked her for it. In those first 6 weeks, Genevieve had tried every legal and civil route available to her. She had presented her deed at the county registrar's office and been told the paperwork was incomplete. She had hired a lawyer named Thomas Gaines, who had taken $20 from her and then disappeared 2 weeks later, presumably with some of Dunley's money in his coat pocket. She had written 2 letters to the county seat and received no response. She had gone to the sheriff, a man named Harlan Beck, and he had listened to her with the patient, empty attention of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is merely waiting for the person talking at him to stop. So she had walked into the Dustfall saloon on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, carrying the deed and carrying the Colt revolver that had belonged to her father, and she had done the only thing she had left to do, which was make clear to Hector Dunley that she was not going to simply disappear. She had not planned on shooting the mirror. She had not planned on Vaughn Mercer. After the shot, the saloon held its terrible silence for perhaps 10 seconds. Then Hector Dunley smoothed the front of his jacket and he said, in a voice like the sound of a coffin lid closing, "You have made a serious mistake today, Miss Parrish." He took 1 step away from the bar, then paused and looked back at her. "The next time I have to come looking for that deed, I will not be asking nicely." He walked out. The saloon began breathing again. Conversations resumed in lower registers. The bartender, a large Finnish man named Pekka who had seen more than most men and reacted to approximately none of it, began carefully sweeping the broken glass from behind the bar. Genevieve stood very still and realized her hand was shaking. "Sit down before you fall down." The voice came from the corner, low, not loud, not commanding exactly, just certain. She turned, and Vaughn Mercer was looking at her still with that same direct, unreadable attention, and he was indicating the chair across from him with a minimal gesture of his coffee cup. She crossed the room and sat down, because her legs were in fact not entirely trustworthy at that moment, and because something in her recognized, even then, that this was not an invitation she should refuse. He was, she observed, perhaps 30 or 31 years old. Dark hair, not quite black, and dark eyes that were difficult to read in the saloon's amber light. He was lean in the way that men who work outdoors in hard weather get lean, with weathered skin and hands that showed the specific calluses of roping and riding. He wore a plain dark coat and plain work clothes with no ornamentation, no flashiness, nothing that would cause a second glance if you saw him on the street. Except that once you looked at him directly, it was surprisingly difficult to look away. He studied her with a careful, unhurried attention that she would later understand was simply his way with everything. "You know who he is," he finally said. "It was not a question." "Hector Dunley," she said. "I am not ignorant of the situation." A brief pause. "No," he agreed. "You are not." He picked up his coffee cup and looked into it, and she had the impression that he was thinking something considerable and deciding how much of it to share. "He has done this before," he said. "He has taken 3 other properties in this county in the last 4 years, a widow named Clara Marsh, a family called the Burtons, A Mexican cattle family, the Garcias, who had been here since before Texas was Texas. He set the cup down. None of them are here anymore. The weight of that settled over her. Where did they go? The Marsh woman went to live with a sister in San Antonio. The Burtons went north. The Garcias. He stopped. Nobody knows. She looked at him steadily. And you are telling me this because he met her eyes. The look was very direct and entirely calm, and it said something she could not quite translate again, something in that complex language he seemed to speak exclusively with his eyes. Then he said, because you should know what you are walking into. I already walked into it. Yes, he said. I saw that. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her, because she was a woman sitting alone with a strange man in a saloon with a gun she had just fired, and very little about this situation should have felt anything other than deeply uncomfortable. My name is Genevieve Parrish, she said. Vaughn Mercer, he said. I have the Broken Spur north of town. I know the Broken Spur. She had heard it mentioned. A well-run operation, people said, honest cattle work. Mercer kept to himself. Your father's land, he said. I knew your father. That landed like a stone in still water. You knew Edmund Parrish, briefly. We crossed paths in '69 when he was first looking at that land. He was a good man, a careful man. He looked at her with that direct steadiness. He talked about his daughter. She did not know what to do with that. She pressed it into a corner of her mind to examine later. What did he say? Something shifted in Vaughn Mercer's expression. It was small, barely perceptible, but she was already beginning to learn to read the small things with him. He said she was the most capable person he had ever known, he said, and that she had her mother's stubbornness and his sense of justice, which meant she was going to either change the world or have a very difficult time of it. Genevieve felt something ache in her chest. He was probably right about both, she said quietly. Vaughn Mercer said nothing, but he looked at her and the look said, I believe that. It also said something else, something she chose not to examine too closely quite yet. Dunley will not stop, he said, not because of a broken mirror. No, she agreed. So I need a plan. You need several things, he said. He stood then, and he was taller than she had estimated, and he put on his hat, and he looked down at her for a moment with that measured, serious attention. Come to the Broken Spur tomorrow morning, he said. I may be able to help. He left before she could respond, moving through the saloon with a quiet efficiency that parted the room around him without effort. She watched him go, and she noticed that several of the other men in the saloon watched him too, with the specific quality of attention that men reserve for other men they respect without necessarily liking. She sat for a moment longer with the cold coffee he had left behind, and the echo of a look she could not stop turning over in her mind. Outside, the autumn wind was pulling leaves from the cottonwoods along Main Street, sending them skittering across the packed dirt in small golden flurries. The light was going amber and low. Somewhere down the street, a horse was tied to a post and standing with its head down against the wind, patient and indifferent to the particular human dramas playing out around it. Genevieve Parrish put the Colt revolver back in the waistband of her skirt and walked back to Mrs. Croft's boarding house. And for the first time in 6 weeks, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel before. She felt like she might not lose. The Broken Spur was 8 miles north of Dustfall along a road that was really just 2 ruts in the grass, and Genevieve made the ride the next morning on the borrowed roan mare, reaching the ranch as the sun was still climbing out of the eastern horizon and painting everything in shades of amber and brass. The land here was beautiful in a way that was entirely different from the eastern parts of Texas she had grown up in. It was wider, more immediate. The sky sat directly on top of you, rather than being framed by trees, and the grass went in every direction like something that had decided to cover the world and was making steady progress. The broken spur was a working ranch in the truest sense, with none of the pretension or decoration of wealth. The main house was solid stone, one story with a long porch running the front. There were 2 large barns, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse, stock pens, and a cattle herd visible in the far distance as a dark shifting mass against the golden grass. The whole operation had the quality of something carefully built and carefully maintained by someone who thought about the long term. Vaughn Mercer was in the near paddock when she arrived, working with a young horse, a dark bay that was clearly still in the early stages of being broken to saddle. He did not use force. That was the first thing she noticed. He was patient with the animal in the same way he had been patient in the saloon, with a quiet persistence that was more persuasion than coercion. The horse moved away from him, and he let it move, and then he moved to it again. And gradually, incrementally, the animal's resistance began to soften. He noticed her arrival without acknowledging it immediately, which she appreciated. He finished what he was doing with the horse, which took perhaps 5 minutes, and then he came to the fence. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and the look said, "You came, and also I am glad. Come inside," he said. "There is coffee." The inside of the house was spare and clean and very orderly, with the particular quality of a space inhabited by someone who lives alone but takes care of their things. There was a large table that served as both work surface and dining table, currently covered in papers and maps. There was a stone fireplace with a fire already going against the November chill. There were books on a shelf near the window, more than she would have expected, their spines worn from handling. She sat at the table and he poured coffee, and then he sat across from her, and he looked at the maps between them with the same focused attention he gave to everything. "Your father's land," he said, indicating a section on a large county map. 400 acres here, running along the creek. It is good land, the best water in this part of the county, which is why Dunley wants it," she said. "It is not only about the water, though the water matters." He traced a line with his finger. "There is talk of a rail spur coming through in the next 5 years. The route they are considering runs directly through or adjacent to your land. Whoever controls that land controls access to the rail for the entire northern portion of the county." She understood immediately, which would make Dunley the freight gatekeeper for every cattle operation in the region. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who expects intelligence and still feels a mild satisfaction when he encounters it directly. "Yes," he said, "including yours." "Including mine," he agreed. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and thought, "How do I stop him?" He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him think, which was a different thing from watching most people think. Most people's thinking was visible, expressed in movement and expression and small unconscious sounds. His thinking was very still. It happened entirely inside him and then emerged as result. "The deed your father has is legitimate," he said. "I know it is, because I know what I am looking at and I have seen the county records. The problem is that the registrar's office is Dunley's man, the sheriff is Dunley's man, the lawyer you hired was Dunley's man, and any judge within 3 counties is either afraid of Dunley or in his pocket. So I cannot use the local legal system," she said. "No. But there is a federal land office in San Antonio that has jurisdiction over contested parcels in this territory. If you can get your deed certified there, Dunley cannot touch it regardless of what he does locally." He paused. "The difficulty is getting there. San Antonio is 2 days' ride. And Dunley will know what you are doing the moment you leave town." She looked at him directly. You said you might be able to help. He met her eyes, and something moved through his expression, something she could not name but that she felt, warm and certain as a hand placed flat over her heart. He said, I can ride with you to San Antonio. I know the federal land agent there, a man named Calloway. He is honest, which is rarer than it ought to be, and I know the roads well enough to avoid the ones Dunley's men watch. She studied him. Why would you do that? The question sat between them for a moment. Because what is happening to you is not right, he said simply, and because your father was a decent man, and because... He stopped, and then continued with a deliberateness that told her he had chosen the words carefully. Because I do not like to see capable people prevented from having what they have rightly earned. It was not the full truth, and she knew it, but it was honest truth as far as it went, and she respected it. When would we leave? She asked. Tomorrow before dawn, he said. I will tell no one in town. You should tell no one either. She nodded. Then she said, I appreciate this, Mr. Mercer. He looked at her again, steady and direct, and this time the look said something simpler. He said her name would do fine without using any words at all. Vaughn, she said, testing it. He gave a brief nod, and she thought she might have seen something almost warm move through his dark eyes, there and then gone, like a star passing behind a cloud. She rode back to town with something shifting inside her that was not only hope, though hope was certainly present. There was something else. Something that made the cold morning air feel less cold, and made the gold of the grass seem deeper and more vivid, and made the sound of her horse's hooves on the hard earth feel like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something difficult. She was not foolish enough to call it what it was. Not yet, but she was aware of it. At dinner that evening, Mrs. Croft set down a plate of beans and cornbread and studied Genevieve with the specific acuity of a woman who has made a long study of people. You look different, she said. I went out to the Broken Spur today, Genevieve said, and kept her voice even. Mrs. Croft was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Vaughn Mercer is a good man. He seems to be, Genevieve agreed carefully. He lost his wife, you know, Mrs. Croft said. Fever. 3 years ago now. Her name was Annalise. She was from Georgia originally, very lovely woman. He has not been unkind to anyone since, but he has been very careful. She considered her word. Closed, I suppose, like a house where the family has gone away for winter and shuttered all the windows. Everything kept perfectly, but nothing coming in or going out. Genevieve thought of the way he had looked at her across the saloon. She thought of the way he had said her father was a good man. She thought of the particular quality of his attention, which was not cold. Which was many things, but was not cold. I understand that, she said. I imagine you do, Mrs. Croft said, and left it there. They left the next morning in the dark. 2 hours before dawn, Genevieve on the roan mare and Vaughn on a solid gray gelding he called Winter. They carried supplies for 4 days, packed efficiently and practically. They spoke very little in the early dark, which did not feel uncomfortable. The silence between them was already beginning to acquire a quality that she associated with people who knew each other well, a silence that was not empty. They rode southwest through the broken hills, avoiding the main road, moving through country that Vaughn knew with the particular intimacy of someone who has ridden it in every season and every kind of weather. He pointed things out occasionally. A rocky outcropping that served as a landmark. A shallow crossing on a creek that was the only reliable ford in this stretch. A place where 3 years ago he had found a pair of mountain lion cubs, their mother dead nearby, and had spent 2 weeks raising them before releasing them in the hill country. She looked at him when he said that, and her expression must have been readable because he said without particular self-consciousness, I could not leave them. No, she agreed. Of course not. On the first night, they made camp in a cedar grove along a creek, with a small fire and the sound of water nearby and the vast Texas sky overhead, so crowded with stars that it looked like something spilled. She was not afraid, which she recognized as something worth noting. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she had known less than a week, and she felt, if anything, safer than she had felt in months. He made coffee over the fire, and they sat on opposite sides of it, and she watched the firelight move across his face, and she thought about what Mrs. Croft had told her about Annalise, about the house shuttered for winter. She thought about his eyes in the saloon, and she thought about her own shuttered places, the rooms she had closed off and kept perfectly and stopped letting anyone approach. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked at her over the fire. "Yes. Why did you sit in the corner of the saloon like that, in the back with your back to the wall?" A brief pause. "Habit," he said. "I like to see the room." "You were watching Dunley before I got there," she said. It was not quite a question. Something moved through his expression. "I have been watching Dunley for a considerable time," he said. "He has been attempting to acquire property adjacent to mine for the last year. I have resisted more successfully than most, partly because I am not vulnerable in the same ways that a widow or a family is vulnerable. I have men, and I have resources, and I have some history with people in this territory who make Dunley prefer to move carefully around me. But you could not simply stop him from going after my land." "Not directly," he said. "Not yet. The federal certification will change the game considerably." He added after a pause, "I should have found a way to reach you sooner. When I heard a parish heir had arrived in Calhoun County, I should have ridden to town that same day." "Why didn't you?" He looked into the fire for a moment. "I told myself it was not my place," he said. "I told myself you would find your own way." "But—" she prompted, because she could hear the unfinished quality of it. "But I think," he said carefully, "that I was not being entirely honest with myself about my reasons for staying away." She held that sentence very gently and did not push it. The second day of riding brought them into different country, rougher and more dramatic, with limestone bluffs rising from the cedar-covered hills, and the clear, cold creeks of the hill country cutting through between them. Vaughn knew this country too, though he had ridden it less frequently, and he navigated it with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything. In the late afternoon of the second day, they encountered a problem. The problem took the form of two men waiting on the road where it narrowed between two bluffs, with the particular quality of waiting that is indistinguishable from ambush. They were Dunley's men, which was evident from several things, including the fact that one of them was a man named Cord Pryor, who was Dunley's personal enforcer and who had a reputation in Calhoun County that was not ambiguous. Vaughn saw them first. He put his hand out in a quiet gesture, and they both stopped their horses on a rise perhaps 200 yards back, concealed by cedar. "Pryor," he said quietly, "and someone I do not know." Genevieve felt the fear arrive, cold and quick. He knew we were coming. "Someone told him," Vaughn said, and his voice was even, but his jaw had tightened. "Or he had someone watching the north road and they guessed our route." She looked at the two men blocking the road below. They were not hiding. They were simply waiting, which was worse because it meant they were confident. "Can we go around?" she asked. "There is a way," he said. "It adds half a day and the terrain is difficult, but yes." He turned his horse without drama, and they moved back through the cedar, angling east and then south through country that was genuinely difficult, steeply pitched and rocky, requiring them to lead the horses through sections where riding was impossible. He went first, picking the way, and he did not complain and he did not express frustration, and she followed him. And several times he stopped and waited for her, and once, when the roan mare stumbled on a loose shale slope. His hand shot out and steadied the horse's head with a calm competence that prevented what could have been a disaster. "Thank you," she said breathlessly. He looked at her with that steady directness. The look said, "I will not let anything happen to you." He nodded once and they continued. They made camp late that evening, later than they had intended, in a shallow draw with good grass for the horses. She was tired in her bones, the honest exhaustion of hard physical effort, and she sat by the fire with her boots off and her feet stretched toward the warmth. He made supper, which she ate with the grateful attention of someone too hungry to be self-conscious about it. He watched her eat with an expression she was beginning to learn, a quiet satisfaction that she was well and warm and fed, as if these things mattered to him personally. "You are thinking about something," she said. "Several things," he said. "Tell me one of them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am thinking that you are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered this. "I am not sure, something less." He paused. "I am not expressing this well." "I think you are expressing it fine," she said, because she understood exactly what he meant, and something in her chest felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. He looked at her directly then, and what she saw in his face was something she had not seen before from him. He had shown her gravity and consideration and a kind of steady concern, but this was different. This was something coming up from a deeper place, something that had perhaps not been permitted to move in some time and was, tentatively, beginning to stir. He did not say anything. But the silence held what he was not saying, and she sat in it, and it felt, against all reasonable expectation, like something that could grow. San Antonio in November of 1874 was a city that could not quite decide what it was. It had the bones of the old Spanish colonial town, the Alamo and the missions and the low adobe buildings along the river, and it had the new American energy overlaid on top of all that history, the frame buildings and the commerce and the military presence and the constant movement of cattle through the southern corrals. It was loud and contradictory, and full of the particular energy of a place that knows it is important. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon, both road-worn, and took separate rooms at a decent hotel near the main plaza. The Federal Land Office was closed for the day, which meant they had until the following morning. Genevieve washed the road off herself and changed into the one good dress she had packed, a dark wool and deep blue that her mother had made years ago and that she only ever wore for serious occasions. She came down to the hotel dining room and Vaughn was already there, and when he saw her in the dress, something moved through his expression that she decided was not her imagination, because she had been watching his face with sufficient attention for the last 2 days to know the difference. They ate dinner in the hotel dining room, which was proper and public and entirely appropriate, and they talked for 2 hours, and she would remember that dinner for the rest of her life. They talked about her father, and about his early years running cattle, and about what it meant to build something in this country and defend it. They talked about the railroad and what it would do to the territory. They talked about books, which led to a long exchange about a novel she had read the previous year that he had also read, and the precise point in the 3rd chapter where she had understood that the story was going to go in a direction she had not expected. He had known at the same point and said so, and she felt the very specific delight of a person who has found another person whose reading matches their own in some essential way. They talked about loss, eventually. About her father's death, which she had not fully permitted herself to grieve because she had been too busy managing the aftermath of it. He listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and when she paused, he did not fill the silence with reassurance. He simply let the space hold what she needed it to hold. Then she said, because it felt right, and because she had never been a person who avoided the things that felt necessary to say. Mrs. Croft told me about Analyze. He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the dining room fireplace crackled softly. She was a good woman, he said. She deserved more time than she got. He turned his coffee cup between his hands. I have not talked about her very much since I found that, well, a brief pause. I found that talking made the not having her worse, so I stopped talking. And stopped other things too, she said quietly. He looked at her directly. And stopped other things too, he agreed. The acknowledgement sat between them for a moment, precise and honest. I am not trying to. I am not suggesting. She stopped and started again. I am simply saying that I understand the impulse. I closed things off too after my father died, after some other things before that. She met his eyes. But I do not think it is a permanent condition, closing off. He held her gaze for a long moment, and what she saw in his face then was something quiet and serious and very deep, like looking down into clear water and seeing farther than you expected. He said, very quietly, "No, I do not think it is permanent either." The Federal Land Office on Friday morning was a large stone building near the military plaza, with a waiting room that smelled of paper and dust, and the specific smell of bureaucratic authority. The land agent, Calvin Calloway, was a lean man of about 50 with a precise manner, and the look of someone who has made accuracy into a personal religion. Vaughn introduced himself, and Calloway shook his hand with the warmth reserved for people you have conducted honest business with over a long period of time. Then Vaughn introduced Genevieve, and she laid her deed on Calloway's desk along with her father's original purchase records and 2 letters from men in Bexar County who had known her father and could attest to his character and the legitimacy of his transaction. Calloway examined everything with the careful thoroughness of a man who knows that the weight of the moment deserves it. He cross-referenced the land descriptions against Federal Survey records. He checked the original recording date and the chain of title. He looked at the signatures and compared them to records he pulled from a heavy filing cabinet in the corner. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the particular satisfaction of a man who has found everything to be exactly as it should be. "Miss Parrish," he said, "this deed is legitimate, fully valid, and properly recorded in the federal land records as of 1868. You are, without any question, the legal owner of the 400 acres described herein." She felt the relief move through her in a wave so strong it almost took her off her feet. "Now," Calloway continued, regarding the interference from a local party. He had listened to her explanation of Dunley's activities with an expression of increasing hardness. "I want to be clear with you. Federal land rights cannot be superseded by local corruption, regardless of how thoroughly that corruption has embedded itself in a county's offices. I am going to prepare a federal certification document that will be registered with the U.S. Land Office in Washington. I am also going to write a formal letter to the U.S. Marshal's office regarding the coercive activities you have described. The Marshal has jurisdiction over federal land matters in this territory, and what Mr. Dunley has been doing falls squarely within federal jurisdiction." He looked at them both over his desk. "This will not happen overnight. It will take some weeks for the wheels to turn, but once they turn, they will not stop." "Thank you," Genevieve said, and then, because she was not a woman who held things inside when they needed saying, "Thank you very much." Calloway looked at Vaughn. "Your instincts about the deed were correct, as usual." "Her father was a careful man," Vaughn said simply. They walked out of the land office into the bright November morning of San Antonio, and the city moved around them, and Genevieve stopped on the sidewalk and just stood for a moment, her face turned up toward the sky, Vaughn stood beside her. He said nothing. But she felt his attention on her, steady and warm, and she turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. He was not being careful with this expression. It was simply there on his face, open and direct and entirely unguarded for one clear moment. She did not look away. "I am going to keep the land," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are. I am going to build something there, something proper, something that lasts." "Yes," he said again, and his voice had a quality she could feel as much as hear, a kind of resonance, like a bell that has been struck and is still ringing. She looked at him in the bright San Antonio morning, this quiet, careful man who had ridden 2 days through difficult country for her, who had helped her without requiring anything, who looked at her like she was worth looking at carefully. And she thought about her father saying she was the most capable person he knew. She thought about the rattlesnake cubs and the cedar grove and the firelight and the dinner conversation. She thought about shuttered houses with everything kept perfectly and nothing coming in or going out. She said, "I would like to see you when we are back in Calhoun County. I would like to continue, whatever this is." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I would like that very much." And the look on his face said everything else. It said, "I have been waiting to be asked." It said, "I was not sure I was ready until this moment, and now I am certain." It said, "I will not take this lightly or carelessly." It said, "You matter to me in a way I am still learning the dimensions of, and I am not afraid of the learning." It said more than any speech she had ever heard. It said more than any promise. She smiled at him, and he looked at her smile with the careful attention of a man who is memorizing something valuable. They rode back to Calhoun County at a more relaxed pace, taking the full 2 days without the urgency of the outward journey, and the change in the atmosphere between them was palpable without being dramatic. They talked more. He initiated conversation occasionally, which she recognized as different from before, and his questions were specific and real, asking about her childhood and what she had studied, and what she had loved and what she had lost. She answered him honestly and asked in return, and he answered her with the same directness he brought to everything. And the picture she assembled was of a man who had been formed by solitude and hard work and genuine love and genuine loss, and who had, in the process of all that, become someone with a great deal of depth that he had simply not been sharing with anyone. She was honored that he was beginning to share it with her. On the second night, riding in, they stopped again in a cedar grove not far from their first camp of the outward journey. It was a colder night, the first real cold of the season coming down from the north, and the fire was necessary rather than merely pleasant. They sat closer to it than before, and closer to each other than before, without exactly planning to. He said at one point, looking into the fire, "I should tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "When you first walked into the Dustfall saloon," he said, "I had been watching Dunley. I had been trying to determine the best moment to intervene, and I had been—" he paused. "I had been talking myself out of caring about anything beyond my own land and my own work for 3 years." She watched his face in the firelight. "And then you came in and put your deed on the bar, and I watched you, and I watched you not flinch when he moved toward you, and I watched you fire that gun without hesitation, and I thought—" He stopped again. "I thought, here is a person who is entirely herself, without apology, in the middle of a very dangerous situation." He turned and looked at her. I had forgotten what that looked like. She held his gaze. What it looked like. Someone being entirely present, he said. Not managing how they appear, not calculating how to be seen, just being exactly who they are. She felt the warmth of that move through her, careful and serious. "You noticed all of that in that first minute." "I notice things," he said simply. "I have always noticed things. I just stopped letting myself care about what I noticed." She reached out, across the small space between them, and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. It was the first time she had touched him deliberately. He went very still, the way he went still when he was thinking something considerable, and then, carefully, slowly, he turned his hand over and held hers. The fire crackled. The cedar smelled sharp and green in the cold air. Somewhere close by, a night bird made its single note and then was silent. The sky above the cedars was full of stars. They stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, their hands held together in the cold night. And it was the most intimate Genevieve Parrish had felt in years, possibly in her life. And she was aware of each breath and the warmth of his hand and the specific quality of the quiet between them that was no longer simply the absence of sound, but was full of something that had no name yet, but was growing toward one. Dunley's response to the federal certification was not immediate. Callaway had warned her it would take several weeks for the paperwork to fully process through Washington, and in that interval, she knew, was the danger. She moved onto the parish land the week she returned from San Antonio. She had enough savings to purchase basic materials for a small initial structure, a one-room cabin that she and Vaughn and 3 of his ranch hands built over the course of a long, cold weekend. His men were respectful and professional, and she did not miss the fact that they respected her without reservation, which told her something about the kind of operation Vaughn ran and the kind of atmosphere he created by example. He came to check on her every 2 or 3 days during those weeks. He always brought something practical. The first time, he brought extra firewood and stacked it himself without being asked. The second time, he brought a cast iron pot that he said he had a spare of, which was plausible but which she suspected was not exactly true. The third time, he brought his own copy of a book they had discussed at dinner in San Antonio, which told her something specific and which she chose to examine thoroughly. She opened it and found on the first page that he had written something. Not much, just for GP, who reads to the same places. It was the most romantic thing she had received from anyone since the first and only time a boy in her hometown had brought her wildflowers when she was 17, and this was considerably better than that. She told him it was the best inscription she had ever received, and he looked at her with that warm steadiness that was becoming familiar to her and said, with complete seriousness, that he was glad. Dunley made his move in early December. She woke one morning to find that someone had pulled up the surveying stakes on the south boundary of her property and scattered them, which was a message and a provocation rather than a practical act. 2 days later, 3 of her fence posts were pulled down. Then one morning, she found that someone had diverted the small tributary that fed her creek. A simple but effective piece of agricultural sabotage that, if left uncorrected, would affect her water access by spring. Vaughn was at her property within the hour of her sending word to the broken spur. He assessed the creek diversion with the focused attention he gave to everything and said, "This is sophisticated. This was done by someone who knows water engineering." He paused. "Dunley has a man named Willis who worked for a railroad survey company before he came to work for Dunley. This has Willis written on it. Can it be repaired?" she asked. "Yes, easily, but we need to make sure it does not happen again." He looked at the creek and then at her. "I want to propose something." "Tell me," she said. "My eastern grazing land borders your northwest corner. If we arrange a formal partnership of some kind, a grazing agreement, a shared use contract, something legal and on record, it gives my men legitimate reason to be on and around your land regularly, which makes it considerably harder for Dunley to continue this kind of harassment without risking a direct confrontation with the broken spur." She looked at him steadily. She knew this was practical. She also knew it was something else as well, a deliberate construction of closeness, a reason to be present, offered in the language of business because the other language was still new between them. A grazing agreement, she said. It would be, he said, and the look he gave her was entirely clear about what it was and was not, mutually beneficial. She felt something rise in her, warm and complicated and entirely wonderful. All right, she said. A grazing agreement. They fixed the creek diversion that afternoon together, working in the cold water up to their knees, which was undignified and very cold and also, she reflected, oddly perfect. He was practical and efficient about the work, and at one point she slipped on a wet stone and his hands caught her upper arms before she went into the water, steady and immediate. And then he set her back on her feet, and they stood very close together for a moment, both wet and cold and flushed from the work, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the look said everything that he was not yet saying with words. "Thank you," she said, for the second time in his company. "Any time," he said, and meant it literally. The weeks that followed had a quality she would try to describe later and find she lacked the words for entirely. It was the quality of something new being made, carefully and with attention, the way a good craftsman makes something that needs to last. He came to her land 3 or 4 times a week now, always with a reason, always practical. And the reasons were real, but they were also, she understood, a grammar they had developed for spending time together while they learned each other. She learned that he was up before dawn every day without exception, that he preferred coffee extremely strong and had no patience for weak coffee, that he had a particular look, a brief narrowing of his eyes and a slight tilt of his head, that meant he disagreed with something but was choosing how to express it. That he laughed rarely, but when he did, it was genuine and real and entirely transformative, changing his entire face in a way that startled her every time. That he was extraordinarily competent with animals and slightly awkward with people he did not know well, not socially awkward but emotionally careful, as if he was protecting both himself and them from something. He learned, she knew, equally specific things about her. That she was never uncertain about what she thought, but was frequently uncertain about whether to say it. That she could work at something for very long stretches without rest, and then hit a wall all at once. That she talked to her horse, which she was not particularly embarrassed about. That she had strong opinions about nearly everything, but held them loosely enough to change her mind when presented with sufficient evidence. One afternoon he arrived to find her on the roof of the cabin, attempting to fix a section of shingles that had come loose in a windstorm, and he stood below looking up at her for a moment, and then climbed up beside her without comment, handing shingles up and holding them while she nailed them. And when they were done, they sat on the roof together in the December afternoon, looking out over the land. "It is beautiful," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She knew he was not looking at the land. She turned and looked at him directly, and he held her gaze without deflecting, and she said quietly, "Vaughn." He said equally quietly, "Genevieve." It was the first time he had used her full name, and the way he said it, with a care and a weight, as if the name itself was something worth handling gently, undid something inside her that she had not known was still held together. She said, "I think you should stop finding reasons to come here and simply come here." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass below and made its long, whispering sound. Then he said, "I was not sure you wanted that." "I want that," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything he did, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair that the wind had freed behind her ear, and his fingers brushed her jaw and stayed there for a moment, warm and certain. "All right," he said. "Then I will simply come here." He kissed her there on the roof of her small cabin, with the December sky enormous and pale blue above them, and the grass moving around them like water. And the kiss was unhurried and sincere, the kiss of two people who have arrived somewhere and know it. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heart, and he put his hand over hers, holding it there, and the warmth of it went through her like light. Christmas in Calhoun County in 1874 was a quiet occasion by the standards of more populated places, but at the Broken Spur it was not quiet at all, because Vaughn had invited her to come for Christmas dinner, and she had arrived to find that Mrs. Croft had also been invited, and Calvin Calloway had made the journey up from San Antonio for the occasion, and 3 of Vaughn's ranch hands and their wives had been included, and the stone house that had been shut and spare and very orderly was full of warmth and firelight, and the smell of the enormous meal that Vaughn had apparently been preparing since the previous day. She stood in the doorway and looked at all of it, at the people and the fire and the decorated branches someone had brought in from the cedar trees outside. And then she looked at Vaughn across the room, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and that she would see for the rest of her life, and never quite get used to in the best possible way. It was an expression of pure happiness, uncomplicated and complete. The letter from the U.S. Marshal's office arrived in the first week of January 1875. Genevieve was at the Broken Spur when Vaughn's man Elias rode in with the mail from town, and she watched Vaughn read the letter with that contained, focused expression she knew well. And then he looked up at her, and his eyes were quiet and certain, and she knew. "The marshal is sending a deputy to Calhoun County," he said, "with the federal certification of your deed and a formal investigation of Dunley's land acquisition practices in this county." He paused. "It will take a few weeks, but it is happening." She sat down at his kitchen table without being asked, because she needed to sit, and she pressed her hands flat on the table's surface and breathed. He came and sat across from her, and he put his hands over hers, and he said, "It is almost over." "He will do something before the marshal gets here," she said. "He will try one more thing." "Yes," Vaughn said, because he did not lie to her. "He will try, but he is going to find that it is considerably more difficult than it used to be." What Dunley tried, 12 days later, was not sophisticated. It was the move of a man who is desperate and has run out of subtlety. He sent 4 men to her property on a night of hard frost, and they attempted to burn the cabin. They did not succeed, because Elias and 2 other Broken Spur ranch hands had been quietly maintaining a nightly presence on her land since the water diversion incident, sleeping in the small outbuilding she had put up for supplies, and they intercepted the arsonists before significant damage was done. There was a confrontation, brief and noisy, and when Genevieve came out with her father's Colt revolver for the second time in this story, she found 3 men held at gunpoint by Vaughn's men and a 4th who had run, and her cabin smoldering at one corner but structurally intact. Vaughn arrived within 20 minutes, having heard the horses and the commotion from the Broken Spur, and he assessed the situation with his characteristic efficiency, and then turned to her and did something he had not done before. He put both arms around her and held her, fully and without reservation, right there in the middle of the January night with the frost on the ground and the smell of smoke still in the cold air. She held him back, both arms around his waist, her face against his shoulder, and she allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to feel that someone was between her and the wind. They held Dunley's 3 men, who were ranch workers rather than hardened criminals, and who were all considerably more frightened than they had anticipated being, until morning, when Sheriff Harlan Beck was compelled to come out and collect them, because the alternative was a federal complications involving the U.S. Marshal's office that even Dunley's influence could not smooth over at this point. Beck arrived at sunrise looking like a man who is beginning to understand that the ground under him is not as solid as it had appeared. He looked at the three men. He looked at Vaughn Mercer. He looked at Genevieve. He looked at the signed statements that Elias and the other hands had prepared describing the attempted arson. He made an expression like a man eating something unpleasant, and then said, in a voice from which all the former authority had drained, "I will take them into custody." "You will do more than that," Vaughn said. His voice was level. "You will charge them with attempted arson and trespass and destruction of private property. And you will forward those charges in writing to the federal marshal's office in Austin, because if they are not received there within the week, Sheriff, there will be considerably more extensive questions asked about how law enforcement has been conducted in this county." Beck looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Genevieve. She met his eyes and said nothing because nothing needed saying, and he knew it. "Yes, sir," he said finally to Vaughn. And then, after a brief pause, looking at Genevieve with something that was probably the first genuine respect he had shown her. "Yes, madam." Deputy U.S. Marshal Theodore Briggs arrived in Calhoun County on the 24th of January, 1875. He was a precise, formal man of about 45 who clearly enjoyed his authority and equally clearly had no interest in being managed or bought. He met with Genevieve and Vaughn together, reviewed the full file that Calloway had prepared, examined the deed, reviewed the incidents of harassment and the attempted arson, and then met with Hector Dunley behind closed doors for approximately 90 minutes. No one knew exactly what passed between Briggs and Dunley in those 90 minutes, but the results were entirely unambiguous. Dunley did not go to prison, which was a failure of justice that she acknowledged plainly, though Vaughn explained that federal prosecutions in this era were limited by several practical realities, and that the marshal had pushed as far as jurisdiction permitted. What Dunley did do was sign a formal acknowledgment of the federal land boundaries in Calhoun County, including a specific and explicit document acknowledging Genevieve Parrish's ownership of her 400 acres. He paid fines. He was put under formal federal notice that any further interference with registered federal landholders in Calhoun County would result in criminal prosecution. And within 3 weeks of Deputy Marshal Briggs's visit, Hector Dunley sold his Calhoun County holdings to a land company in Houston and moved south. He was not gone from the world. He was not punished as thoroughly as he deserved. But he was gone from Calhoun County, and Genevieve Parrish stood on her 400 acres in the clear, cold light of a February morning and felt the land under her feet as something she owned, legally and completely, with no shadow over it. Vaughn stood beside her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The grass was winter pale but still rich, and the creek ran cold and clear, and the sky was that particular Texas blue that requires a specific quality of winter light, deep and saturated and entirely itself. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She turned to him. She had been thinking about something for several weeks and now felt the moment for it exactly. She said, "I want to talk to you about something." He turned to face her, and his expression was open and attentive. "I am going to build here," she said. "A proper house, a working ranch. I have plans, and I have learned enough in these months to understand what is needed. This land was my father's investment, and it is going to become something that honors what he believed this territory could be." "Yes," he said, "I know that." "I do not want to do it alone," she said. He was very still. "I am not asking you to come work my land," she said. "I am asking you whether the thing between us is what I think it is, whether it is going somewhere. Because I have done enough pretending in my life that things are not what they are, and I am too old for it now." "You are 26, he said, and there was something in his voice that was very nearly that rare laugh of his. "I am too settled in my character for it," she amended. "I know what I want. I want to know if we are in agreement." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the grass between them and around them. He had his hat in his hands, which she had noticed was something he did when he was feeling something considerable, a specific and unconscious gesture. He said, "Genevieve, I have been in love with you since about the 3rd day of our acquaintance. I have been trying to conduct myself in a way that was not precipitous or inappropriate or too fast for you, because you have been dealing with a very serious set of circumstances and I did not want to." "Vaughn," she said. "Yes. You are doing the thing where you find a lot of words for something that only needs a few words." He looked at her, and then that rare, transformative smile moved across his face, full and real and entirely for her. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Genevieve Parrish." She took the one step between them and took his face in her hands and looked at him, this quiet, careful man who had ridden through the dark before dawn to help her, who had fixed her creek and stacked her firewood and climbed onto her roof and held her in the January night, who looked at her like she was worth looking at carefully, who said more with one look than any man she had ever met. And she said, "Yes. That is what I was asking about." He put his arms around her, and she felt him laugh, the full real laugh against her hair, and then he tilted his face down and kissed her, and it was not careful this time. It was full of everything he had been containing for months, all the warmth and depth of him that he had been slowly, carefully opening to her, and it was the most alive she had felt in years, possibly ever. They were married in the spring, in the 2nd week of April, 1875. The ceremony was held outdoors on the parish land, because that was what Genevieve wanted, and what Genevieve wanted, Vaughn had made clear with great sincerity and complete consistency. He intended to support with everything he had. Mrs. Croft cried, which she would have denied if asked. Calvin Calloway came up from San Antonio with his wife, a warm, articulate woman named Helen, who immediately declared Genevieve remarkable, and meant it as the highest possible compliment. Elias and the other broken spur hands cleaned up their Sunday clothes, and stood in a clean row, and were clearly moved in the way that people are moved when someone they respect finds something good. There was a minister from the Methodist Church in the nearest larger town, who performed the ceremony with a simple dignity that suited both of them. The grass was beginning to green with the spring rains, and the creek was running high and musical, and the sky was enormous and clear and blue. Vaughn stood at the front of the assembled group and watched Genevieve walk toward him, and she watched his face, and what was on his face was that same unguarded, pure happiness she had first seen at Christmas, and it undid her in the best possible way every time, and she hoped it never became ordinary to her, and she was right to hope that, because it never did. The minister asked the words and they said the words back. When he said, "You may kiss your bride," Vaughn looked at her first, one long steady look that said everything, that said, "I will take care of what you trust me with. I will look at you like this for the rest of my life. I am exactly as certain as I appear to be." And then he kissed her in front of everyone, properly and without rush. And there was a sound from the assembled group that was half applause and half the soft expression of people witnessing something that reaffirms their belief in the worthwhileness of things. They spent that spring and summer building the Parish Mercer operation, which was what they called it, combining their 2 adjacent properties into a shared enterprise that was run with both of their sensibilities, which meant it was run very well. Vaughn's practical competence and long-term strategic thinking combined with Genevieve's organizational capability and absolute refusal to accept anything less than what was right. And the result was an operation that people in the county paid attention to. They hired a range manager named Arthur de Leon, a Mexican-American man whose family had ranched in this territory for generations, and who knew the land in ways that years of study could not replicate. Vaughn had worked with Arthur before and respected him enormously, and Genevieve recognized within the first meeting that Arthur was someone whose knowledge was invaluable and whose history with this land deserved recognition. She made sure the terms of his employment were fair and documented, and she asked him to tell her everything he knew about the water and the grass and the seasonal movements of the land. Arthur looked at her with an expression she recognized as cautious hopefulness, the look of a man who has been disappointed by good intentions before but is willing to try again. Over the months that followed, the caution diminished and the hopefulness remained, and Arthur de Leon became one of the most essential people on the combined operation. By that autumn, they had 300 head of cattle on the Parrish Mercer range. The small cabin had been expanded into a proper house, stone and timber, with a front porch that ran the full width of the house and looked out over the grass toward the creek. Genevieve planted a kitchen garden along the east wall and a small flower garden that she tended with the same focused attention she gave to everything. On winter evenings, they sat together by the fire, she rating and he doing accounts or working on the equipment maintenance records he kept with meticulous accuracy. And the silence between them was the complete, inhabited silence of two people who have chosen each other and keep choosing each other and find the choosing easy. He still looked at her the way he had always looked at her. She had wondered, in the private, worried corners of herself, whether familiarity would blunt it, whether daily proximity would flatten the particular acuity of his attention into something ordinary. It did not. If anything, it deepened, because now it came with knowing. He looked at her and she knew he was seeing everything, the things she had shown him and the things he had understood without her needing to show them, and the look still said, every time, more than any speech. In the spring of 1876, they found that she was expecting their first child. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am extremely well." He kissed her with the thoroughness of a man making a statement. Their son was born in October of 1876, delivered by Mrs. Croft, who had decided that her skills as a practical nurse were equal to the occasion, and was absolutely right. He was a healthy, furious, dark-haired baby who arrived before dawn on a cold morning, and made his presence known with an enthusiasm that suggested he had inherited his mother's directness and his father's determination. They named him Edmund for her father and called him Eddie, and he was from his first conscious moments the object of a devotion so complete that both his parents were slightly astonished by its force. Vaughn with the baby was something she had not anticipated, quite prepared herself for, which was foolish in retrospect because she knew who he was. He held his son with the careful, complete attention he gave to everything he valued, and she would find them sometimes, in the early mornings when she was still sleeping, sitting by the fire together, the baby propped against his father's chest, both of them apparently entirely satisfied with the arrangement. She stood in the doorway and watched them on those mornings and felt something she did not have words for. She had words for most things, which was one of the things that made her effective in the world. But this specific feeling, the particular warmth and completeness of watching the man she loved hold their child in the firelight of the home they had built in the country that was theirs, had a quality that exceeded language. The years moved with the particular rhythm of working land in a territory that was still becoming itself. The railroad spur that Vaughn had predicted arrived in 1878, and its route, as he had forecast, ran adjacent to the Parrish Mercer Range, giving them precisely the access advantage that had made the land worth fighting for. They were among the first operators in the county to ship cattle east by rail, which changed their economics entirely and allowed them to expand. Sheriff Harlan Beck was not re-elected in 1876. His replacement, a straightforward man named James Colton from Hill County, was exactly what the county needed. The Clark family, who had bought Dunley's former holdings, were decent neighbors, and the general character of Calhoun County shifted over those years in the direction of something more just and more workable, though slowly and imperfectly, as these things always move. Arthur de Leon brought his family to live on the combined property in 1877, building a house on the northern section, and his knowledge and loyalty became a cornerstone of everything the operation did. Genevieve made sure his contribution was documented and recognized, and she taught herself enough Spanish to conduct the parts of their working conversations that Arthur found easier in his first language, which he appreciated in a way he expressed through a quality of commitment to the shared enterprise that went well beyond what employment alone could have produced. In the spring of 1878, Genevieve discovered she was expecting again. This time, she was more practiced at reading Vaughn's contained expressions, and she told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning again, for no particular reason except that the kitchen on Tuesday mornings had apparently become their place for important news. He processed it with the same inward stillness and then looked at her with that full, unguarded expression, and this time the look said something new in addition to everything it had always said. It said, "Look at what we have built. Look at what we keep building." Their daughter arrived in November of 1878. She was serene and watchful from her first days, with Genevieve's coloring and Vaughn's dark, attentive eyes, and she looked at the world around her with the specific quality of a person who is paying very close attention and forming careful conclusions. They named her Clara, for Clara Marsh. The widow Dunley had dispossessed years earlier, because Genevieve had never forgotten that name and had never found the right form for the fact that she had survived what Clara had not, and this felt right. Eddie, 2 years old and entirely himself, was perplexed by his sister initially, and then decided she was acceptable on the grounds that she was interested in him, which she was. He showed her things with the enthusiastic authority of a firstborn who has recently become an authority on the world, and she watched everything he showed her with those dark, careful eyes. Vaughn watched his children the way he watched everything, with full attention and without show. But Eddie had discovered by the age of 3 that his father's silence was not emptiness, but was instead full of things, and he had developed the habit of asking his father what he was thinking, and Vaughn always told him in careful and honest terms, which Eddie received with a gravity that made Genevieve want to gather them both into her arms simultaneously. She often did. On an autumn evening in the year 1880, Genevieve sat on the front porch of the house she had built on the land she had fought for, watching the grass go gold in the last horizontal light. She was 32 years old. She was tired in the pleasant way of a person who has worked hard at something that matters. The kitchen garden had done well this year. The cattle herd was the largest it had been. Eddie, 4 years old and ferociously curious, was somewhere behind the house being supervised by Elias, who had appointed himself the children's unofficial guardian with a seriousness that suggested it was the role he had always been waiting for. Clara was inside, asleep. She heard Vaughn come out of the house and felt him sit down beside her, and then felt his arm come around her shoulders, pulling her gently against him, and she settled her head onto his shoulder and they looked out together at the land. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, using Eddie's question. He was quiet for a moment in that way he had, the real thinking way, not the avoiding way. Then he said, "I was thinking about the first time I saw you," she smiled. "In the saloon." "In the saloon," he agreed, "with the gun and the broken mirror." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "You looked magnificent." She laughed and felt his arm tighten around her. "I was thinking," he continued, "about what I was feeling in that moment, and how I could not have articulated it then, because I was not in the habit of articulating things." A pause. "I was thinking that it was the first time in 3 years I had seen something and wanted to be close to it, and I did not understand at the time what that meant exactly. But I understand it now." She turned her face up toward him, and he looked down at her. And there it was, that look, exactly the same as it had always been, and at the same time full of everything that had accumulated since. All the days and the nights and the hard work and the laughter and the children sleeping inside and the land stretching out golden in front of them. She said, "You know what I have thought about many times." "Tell me," he said. "That if Dunley had been less greedy, if my lawyer had been honest, if any of the smaller injustices along the way had not happened, if I had taken a different route that afternoon and walked into a different saloon, or no saloon at all." She paused. "You were sitting in that corner in the back with your back to the wall watching Dunley, and I walked in. And the whole thing only happened because so many wrong things had lined themselves up in a row." He considered that. "Or," he said, "the whole thing happened because you were the kind of person who walks into a saloon with a deed and a gun. And I was the kind of person who sits in the corner watching and waiting until the right moment." He looked at her directly. Maybe it was only ever going to happen this way. She thought about that for a moment. "That is either fate or logic," she said. "With you and me," he said, "I do not think there is much difference." She looked at the land in the last golden light, and she thought about her father saying she would either change the world or have a very difficult time of it. She thought about Mrs. Croft saying Vaughn was a good man, with the authority of someone who had been watching people long enough to know. She thought about Calvin Calloway saying her deed was legitimate and valid and entirely hers. She thought about Eddie asking his father what he was thinking and Vaughn always telling him, always being honest with their son in the way he had always been honest with her. And she thought about Clara's dark, watchful eyes, and the particular way she looked at the world as if she was already deciding what she thought about it. She thought about the look in the saloon, across the smoky room, steady as a compass needle. "I see you. You are not alone. Be careful now." She had been careful. She had been very careful. She had also been brave and stubborn and occasionally reckless and entirely herself, and all of it had brought her here. To this porch. To this land. To this man sitting beside her with his arm around her, who had never once made her feel like she was too much or not enough, who had made her feel instead, from that first extraordinary look across the room, like she was exactly the right amount of everything. "I love you," she said. Simply and directly, the way she said everything that mattered. He looked at her and the look said everything back. It said all of it. It said, "I loved you before I knew how to say it." It said, "I will love you in ways I am still discovering." It said, "You are the thing that made the shuttered house open its windows again, and the light that came in was yours." Then he said it in words too, because he had learned in these years that words were worth using when you had them. "I love you," he said. "Genevieve Mercer." She smiled, and he smiled back, and they sat together in the last light of the autumn evening on the land that was theirs, that they had fought for and built on and filled with life. while their children slept inside and the grass went quiet and golden, and the stars began, one by one, to come out over the hill country sky. In the house behind them, Eddie woke from an early sleep and called for his father, and Vaughn stood up without hurry and pressed a kiss to her hair and went inside. And she heard his voice in the house, low and certain, answering whatever their son needed. And she sat for a moment longer in the autumn dark with the smell of the grass and the sound of the creek, and the warmth of everything she had made here still wrapped around her like something she intended to keep. She had spent a great deal of time since then learning the language of those looks. She had learned it well. She spoke it back fluently now, and it was the language they used most between them, though words had their place and were used with care and meant what they said always. She stood up from the porch, and she went inside, to the warm light and the fire and her husband and her children, and the particular, irreplaceable life she had refused to give up when it would have been much easier to do so. Outside, the Texas night settled over the Parrish Mercer land with the patient completeness of something that has been here a long time and intends to remain. The grass moved in the dark. The creek ran cold and clear over its stones. The stars overhead were the same stars that had watched everything, the struggle and the fear and the breakthrough and the love. And they continued watching, indifferent to human drama but present for it, in the way that all truly permanent things are present for everything that is temporary and precious and entirely worth the fight.